as Seth just mentioned, this is very much 3.3 is very much a definitional section. Why are we talking about environmental issues right now? Why do we roll from disclosure of material facts into environmental issues? Because remember, material facts are things that would impact the use, the desirability, the value of the property for buyers and sellers.
Right.
Would environmental issues on the property very much fall within that category of material facts? What do y'all think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
These are very
literally
important material facts.
It could literally fall under every single one of those classifications. And now you're not going to be tested on it, but like your client's ability to close based on their loan, if it's near a hazard site, they might not be able to get the loan.
They might not be able to get the loan. If
all
the contamination is on the property, that's fact about the property. If the contamination is nearby, that's a fact that affects the property, right? So this becomes a material fact that we have to deal with, the potential for environmental hazards on the property. The other thing that's interesting about this is that the federal government gets involved very quickly when environmental hazards come into play, because environmental hazards are regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, which is a federal agency. Now, the way the government approaches this, and it's not always been this way, this has been a relatively recent sort of change, and it really puts a lot more responsibility on us as real estate brokers for this. We now practice in this country what's called strict liability for the cleanup cost. What that means is the owner of the land is liable for the cleanup cost.
Let that sink in for a second.
Even if the owner of the land did not create the hazard, doesn't know about the hazard, the owner of the land is responsible for the cleanup cost. And I saw the question come up, is this applicable to commercial properties? Absolutely. In fact, even more so. Let me give you an example. Somebody buys a gas station that's been there for 50 years. Those tanks buried in the ground. They find out 2 years after they buy the gas station that the old tanks, which aren't even being used anymore, have leaked and contaminated the soil. And it's going to cost $4 million to excavate those tanks and clean out the soil and replace it. Who's on the hook for that cost? Is it the seller who sold the property and didn't tell you the tanks were leaking? Or is it the new owner who now owns the land?
The new owner.
The new owner who owns the land. Does that put a ton of responsibility on our shoulders, folks, when we are talking about environmental issues?
Holy moly, yes.
Yeah.
Like, you need to recommend inspections.
Yes, to your clients.
Yes.
Remember, we don't recommend anything to customers. But to our clients, we should recommend environmental inspections. In some way, environmental inspections of the land itself are probably even more important than inspections of the physical structure. Because here's the thing. You can pretty much buy any house, tear it down, and rebuild it for a couple $100,000. But environmental issues can easily run up hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars in cleanup costs. A couple of years ago, about 3-4 years ago now, in Raleigh, two gentlemen were fishing on Crabtree Creek. Now, if you're not familiar with Raleigh, you're probably familiar with at least Crabtree Valley Mall. Crabtree Creek runs directly behind Crabtree Valley Mall through Raleigh. And these gentlemen were fishing in like a little canoe, John boat type thing. And they noticed an oil sheen on the water in Crabtree Creek. So they called the North Carolina Department of Natural Resources, who went out to take a look. They saw the oil sheen. Well, they put out those little buoy things, to kind of contain it, to collect the oil. And they started working it back upstream until they found the source of the contamination. Mm-hmm. It was coming from a residential property that backed up to Crabtree Creek. Lady that owned the house had just purchased it 6 months before. House had a buried underground oil storage tank in the backyard because it was old and it was built to be heated with fuel oil.
Yes.
The tank had not been used for 20, 30 years, but it was still in the ground. She had no idea that the tank was in the ground and the tank had leaked. The EPA came in and cleaned up the issue. They cleaned up the creek. They cleaned up her yard. They excavated the tank. They replaced the soil. And they sent her a bill for $314,000.
Wow.
Poor
Yeah.
lady. Oh my God.
Give her
Crazy.
$1 a month.
Here's what I want you to hear. It would have probably cost her $200 when she was buying that property to have a company come in and investigate that yard and look for underground buried storage tanks.
Right.
Is that an inspection she should have had done?
Yes.
Yes.
Because you can stop it. I mean, I don't want to go too far down this, but you can stop it before it gets too bad like that. Because when people stop using it and they switch over to different fuel sources or electricity sources, that tank just stays in the ground and
Right.
it's subject to weather.
Right.
So
It's going to rust, you know?
Yeah.
And the big thing is here, not knowing is not an excuse. You know, you're going to be held responsible for the cost of what's on your property. So again, when you have buyer clients, now not buyer customers, but buyer clients, what should you be recommending they do?
get
Get an environmental.
Environmental inspection done.
Yes.
Right? Have the property evaluated for potential environmental hazards. Jessica, you had your hand up.
No, I was just gonna say, get all the inspections, that's all.
Yeah, and other Jessica had her hand up as well. Did you? No?
Okay, look, I was gonna share, it's like, this is my first time taking the class. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
yes.
Okay, so this is the first time I take this class. So it's the first time I'm actually looking into this, and I just wanted to share. So my boss, the person I work for, he was looking into this commercial property. You know, great price, great location, and I don't know much. So I did tell him, I'm like, hey, how about you get an inspection? Because MLS looks great, everything looks great, but it was just too good to be true in my eyes, and I handle all his administration. He did get somebody to go look out there. So about this much portion was the best soil, dirt, and you can imagine, the really good kind. But once we started digging, because it was weird that it has really good soil, really good everything, what's going on. Once the inspector got there and he digged farther in, and I'm talking about with like a bobcat, there was a pond there before. That pond was filled with concrete debris. It was full of all types of debris you could imagine of. And it was like, I believe a construction person was dumping all their trash there, covered it up with really good soil, sand, and put it on the market. The people were going through a really nasty divorce. And at that moment, you know, I was just like, we had already paid like a $5,000 vigilance. I can't say the word, vigilance, something fee.
Due diligence.
And yeah, so, you know, the realtor in this case that was helping us out, the agent, which we had a contract with him and everything, he should have been able to look into that because there was no signs. There was a little pond there before. But once we looked and looked and looked, we found this really, really old like blueprint where it showed the pond there. So they knew it was there. They
Well, and
never said
again,
it.
here's the thing. People get so fascinated on about what somebody knew. And that's where humans are just flawed. It doesn't matter. And I appreciate you sharing the story. It doesn't matter what they knew. They're the seller. They're not obligated to what? They're not obligated to tell you.
Yeah.
They're not, even if they know, they're not obligated to tell you. Remember, we are a caveat emptor state from the seller's perspective. But listing broker, would that be a material fact for a listing broker?
Yes, yes.
Absolutely. As a buyer's agent, should you be recommending they evaluate that property? They have some type of an environmental study done.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Shane, what's up?
She's kind of touched base a little bit on it, but all the properties you've sold over the years, say you get a farmhouse, 200 acres of land, and it's got a bunch of woods with it, with a creek. Do you hire someone to come out and check? Because you know, farmers just go pile junk, metal, and everything in the woods, and it's growing up, and then it starts leaking into the creek.
Right.
You hire someone to go and check?
I recommend the buyer does if they're my client.
Okay.
Now, whether they take that recommendation or not is up to them, but I tell them why it's important, and then they have to decide whether or not that's important enough for them.
Okay. Because I was kind of wondering, if you get 200 acres, 300 or 400 acres, it'd be quite
Right.
expensive. So
It will be, and some of them will say, you know what, it's more expensive. I'm willing to take the chance, and that's fine. That's their choice. They're the buyer. My job is to advise.
okay. All right.
Yep.
Thank you.
Jordan.
Yes, I don't know if y'all have driven through Raleigh. The Richmond area. There's a paper factory there, which really smells stinchy. That would be an environmental problem
Oh,
as well,
say it
right?
ain't so. You mean that pulp mill in Halifax County is a material fact?
Oh, Halifax County. Oh, yes.
When they crank that thing up.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Paper factory.
Now, guys, I have to rein us back in here because I know it gets really exciting in this one, but remember, we're learning to pass the test at this point.
Right.
Post licensing is when we start to figure out, well, what if the mineral rights were sold? What if this was happened?
Right.
I get it. It's exciting and cool stuff.
And so we're focusing on the disclosure part of the thing.
Yes.
Now, one common disclosure item that you will certainly see on a test, one common environmental hazard in residential construction is paint that contains lead, aka lead-based paint. Lead-based paint just means paint that has lead in it. And yes, it is the same. It's lead that is in pencils. It is, which most of them are graphite now, but lead is a metal, heavy metal substance, and it is in lots of things. At one point in time, it was in gasoline. Some of you are old enough. I'm not going to put you out there on that like that, but some of you are old enough to remember why the pumps now say unleaded, because at one point it was a choice. You got leaded or unleaded, right? It was in gasoline at some point in time. It was used as an addition to paint as well, because it helped with the durability of paint. Sometimes if you come across really old people, they'll complain and say paint is garbage since they took the lid out of it. And that is true in some regards. It was much more durable when it contained lead. Unfortunately, it was also deadly when it contained lead, and they just did not know that. Lead is a very dangerous neurotoxin. What that means is that it impacts, in particular, mental development. It is especially hazardous for children. Now, you need to know this year. This year is very important when it comes to lead-based paint, or paint that contains lead. Shannon said, do you need to disclose this to customers too? Absolutely. What are we talking about, folks? Environmental issues are what?
Material facts.
They are material facts. Everything in this section is an example of an environmental issue, and all environmental issues are material facts. So these absolutely would be disclosure issues to customers. Okay. If a residential property was built prior to 1978, it might have lead-based paint. That does not mean it definitely has lead-based paint. It means it could, or it may have paint that contains lead. So should you, remember, this is disclosure to customers. Should you disclose to customers, this property absolutely has lead-based paint just because it was built before 1978?
No.
No, because you don't know that for a fact. You know that it what? Might have lead-based paint. Now, here's the thing. Just like any other material fact, are we required to get an expert to come out and evaluate every potential issue, or are we required just to give the fact and then let the buyer decide if they want to go further?
Just give the fact.
Give the fact.
I know for a fact that this house was built in 1978. Commonly, houses prior to 1978 might have been constructed with lead-based paint.
There's the
You might
fact.
want to get that inspected
The
to your
fact
client.
is this house was built at a time when it might contain lead-based paint. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Now, clearly, if the inspection, the investigation's already been done, and you know for sure that there is lead-based paint, would that also be a material fact? Just like any other material fact that you have absolute knowledge of. Would that be a material fact?
Yes.
Yes.
Now we're disclosing presence.
But Don't fall for that trap on the test where it says, oh, you have to investigate the property for lead-based paint. That's not true.
Right.
What we have to do is disclose the material fact that lead-based paint could be in the property. Is everybody with me on that?
Yes.
And then it's up to the buyer or the tenant, because this also applies to rentals. It's up to the buyer or the tenant to decide if they want to go forward with investigating the property. And this will also show up on the test.
Yep.
By federal law, this is the only material fact that has its own little period of time. By federal law, any buyer or tenant who signs a contract to either purchase or rent, so this applies to leases too,
That's huge.
purchase or rent residential property that was built before what year?
1978.
1978 has 10 days after they sign the contract. So even after they sign a lease, are they bound or do they still have 10 days?
Days.
They still have 10 days to do what if they choose to?
Investigate.
Hire somebody to go in and do what?
Inspect.
Investigate, inspect that property for the presence of lead-based paint. Everybody with me on that?
Yes.
Okay. So that's buyers or tenants of residential property built before 1978 have 10 days after they go under contract to conduct their own investigation if they choose to. Now, a lot of them do not. So how would you explain that to somebody? Remember, they're your customer, not your client. You're not going to use words like you should or I would if I was you. How are we going to say that to a customer? What
You
y'all
have
think?
10 days to get this checked out if you want.
House was built before 1978. You got 10 days if you would like to check it out
Right.
for lead-based paint. Eric, you had your hand up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Now the 3-day clause with the contract and the 10-day.
What
time-
3-day clause? I don't know what you're talking
Not
about.
clause.
Santa
Okay.
Claus or what?
Not quite. 3-day period of time, which we need to, which we can pull back with the contract, that the buyer can actually pull the contract back within the 3 days of.
I know what you're talking about, but I'm not sure you do yet. Under what circumstance? Because you still haven't said why a buyer would have 3 days. I know where you're going, but I don't think you do
Oh,
yet. So,
Okay, with disclosure. So after the disclosure has been made, before, okay, wait a minute. Before
they
this-
only have 3 days to
3 days.
get out if they didn't get
There you
the
go.
residential property disclosure from the seller.
Correct. So is that 10 days running concurrent with that, or does that make a
It
difference?
has nothing to do with it. It has
Okay.
nothing. One has nothing to do with the other. One has to do with the residential property disclosure statement, whether they received that from the seller. The other is whether they received a disclosure or not. They get 10 days specifically for the purpose of investigating that property for lead-based paint. Okay. So the two rules don't overlap. They don't have anything to do with each other.
And the
Period.
10 days start again, when? The 10
As
days,
soon as you go under contract.
soon as you under contract, got
As soon
it.
as you go
Okay.
under contract. That's right.
Every-
Yep.
Contract. Okay, got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Now, a lot of buyers and a lot of tenants will choose not to have this done. That is up to them. Now, again, I constantly got to draw this sort of, comparison. If I am talking to a customer, it might have lead-based paint. You got 10 days to check. If I'm talking to my client, what am I going to say?
Check it.
I advise that you do check.
I advise that you have this evaluated because this could be lethal. This could kill you or someone you love if it's there. You need to know. You need to know. Does everybody see how it's different if it's your client?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So make sure you
And
give
this does include the year 1978, just to be clear.
yes.
It's up to and before.
Right. They're not gonna tease it out that close.
Right. I always did wonder that though. So,
And yes, it can complicate things for renovation, Stephanie, because the more you disturb it, the more dangerous it is. Now, the test will also ask you, well, what do we do about it? If the property has lead-based paint, we're not just going to set it on fire and burn it down. What do we do about it? What are the available remedies or fixes for lead-based paint in the property? One of them has a fancy name, but is actually very straightforward. This is the most popular way of treating lead-based paint, encapsulation. Sounds super fancy, but you need to be familiar with the terminology. What do you think encapsulation means, folks?
You know,
Paint over.
Paint over it. Now, that only works if the paint that you're painting over is in good shape. If the lead-based paint has started to peel or flake off, encapsulation is not an option at that point in time. It has to be removed. And I'm just going to point this out, it's not going to be on the test. It is against federal law to scrape lead-based paint, even in your own home.
And I think paint it yourself, right?
You cannot disturb it at all, period. No self-renovation, no cutting a hole in the wall, no scraping the paint off. You can't go outside and scrape the paint off of your windows if your house was built in 1945 because it's got lead-based paint in it. You have to hire somebody who is a professional. And that's what this picture you see up here, right here, that's what they're doing. That's what it looks like when they're removing lead-based paint from a home. And notice that not only are they wearing protective gear, look at the ground. What do they have on the ground?
Plastic.
cover.
Plastic tarps, because that paint, when it hits the ground, the lead will absorb into the ground and poison the groundwater. Right? Timothy said, what if they don't know it was lead-based paint? What would be the consequence for painting over it? First of all, there's no consequence for encapsulating. That is what encapsulating is. Painting over it is always allowed, as long as it's in what?
Shape.
Good condition.
Painting over it is fine. It's disturbing it, removing it, that is a problem. You're violating the federal law. You can be fined, you can go to jail.
Doesn't that also apply to black mold as well, Everett?
It does, but we don't talk about it in real estate classes nearly as much. They don't test it for whatever reason. I'm not sure why.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Erica said, how are we even here if it was that bad? Some of us are not, you know. Some of us have heard the expression, what did you eat paint chips as a kid? That's why that was an expression, you know, because it literally, like, you know. And here's the sad thing. We shouldn't joke about it, but they're all old now, so we can joke about it. You know what things that were painted with lead-based paint? Cribs.
Wow.
And what do babies do?
Chew in the crib.
They put their mouth on everything.
Yeah.
You know, one of the biggest sources of lead-based poison was actually cribs and toys. Toys were routinely painted with lead-based paint, especially metal toys, you know? And what does a kid do? You give them a Hot Wheels car, what do they do with it? In their mouth, you know? And so baseboards, windowsills, all of those things commonly have lead-based paint. We still have deaths in this country of children every year, folks, from lead-based paint, even though it's been outlawed since 1978, because that's one of the dangers of older properties. If it's been painted over, if it ever starts to peel, that's a problem, you know? And so we have to still be conscious of this, even though it's so long ago, you know? Now, let me back up.
Quick question. Is the addendum, that is for, no, I'm sorry, the brochure is for sellers to provide. It's an addendum / brochure. It is for owners to provide, not just sellers, but landlords as well. That basically, it's an opportunity for the seller to say, hey, my property is built before 1978 and it might have lead-based paint. Here's what I know about the lead-based paint, if anything. Okay. Now, the other way to deal with lead-based paint is, of course, to remove it, but that is much more expensive. Removing it involves professionals who are licensed to deal with it. They have to dispose of it in certain places because it's considered an environmental hazard. It's not fun to remove lead-based paint. But this is also a discussion you have to have with your buyer clients, not customers, but clients, when they're considering older homes. The older it is, the more you're going to get into things like potential environmental hazards. Those underground storage tanks, much more likely in what?
Older homes.
Older homes, right? The older it is, the more likely it is to have things like this. So look at this question. It says a home built in 1969 is being leased in Durham. Which of the following statements is true regarding lead-based paint hazards in the home? A, the landlord must conduct an environmental test of the home to be sure it is free of lead-based paint. B, the tenant is required to inspect the property for lead-based paint within the first 10 days after lease signing. C, any lead-based paint found in the property must be removed in order for the home to be rented. Or D, the landlord and their agent are required to inform the tenant that the possibility exists for lead-based paint to be in the property.
D.
D. Good. Very good. D. D. The tenant is not required, and this is where you have to be really careful of like buzzword things. You can't just hone in on 10 days, 10 days, 10 days. They're going to do that to you intentionally in questions, folks. Yes, the tenant has 10 days to check after lease signing, but they're not required to do it. They're not required to inspect. That's up to them. It's up to them. Okay, we all good with that?
Yep.
Okay, good. Kayla, I'm not sure what you mean about remediation is for mold. Remediation is treating any environmental hazard. Remediation is anytime you take an environmental hazard and remove it, that is a type of remediation. It's one type of remediation is removal, as an example, but that can be applied to pretty much any environmental contaminant, like radon gas. We can remediate radon gas by removing the excess radon gas from the property. So what is radon gas? This is a naturally occurring gas. This is not something like lead-based paint that was brought onto the property. This is something that actually is produced by the land itself. It is a naturally occurring hazard.
Mhm.
You are all currently breathing radon gas. It is around us at all times. It is only hazardous in high concentrations. In low concentrations, it is not considered to be hazardous at all. But in high concentrations, it has been found to cause cancer. Now, you cannot smell it, you cannot see it, you cannot taste it. There is no way to know that radon gas is at a high level other than to test the property for radon gas. The good news is that testing is super cheap. Any of you ever bought a radon test for your property or had one done?
No.
Folks, they sell them at Lowe's for about $18. Radon home test kit. So this is not something that people should be, refusing to do. In my opinion, as a buyer's agent, when I'm working with buyer clients, radon test, if they say, well, I don't want to pay for a radon test, I'll pay for it for you. This is one I'll pay for, because there's no reason not to do it.
$75.
Right. The cost is so many, even done professionally, as Seth just mentioned, you're only talking about $75 or so. It's such a minimal cost, to see if the property has a high concentration of radon gas. Now, it is very hit or miss. There is no really way to predict it. The test needs to be done on a property by property basis. You can have one home that has high radon and the next door is fine.
Right.
So the real question is, number one, what level do we consider high? That will show up on the test. Okay.
Right.
That is here on this slide. 4 picocuries. Anything above 4 picocuries is considered a high risk level of indoor radon. But the remediation is relatively simple. Even if the property has a high level of radon, they can install a fan in the crawl space or a fan under the slab that circulates air, and that will address the issue. Usually radon remediation costs anywhere from about $1,000 to $1,500. It is not overly expensive to deal with.
But a lot of new homes, I say this every time, are starting to, put the
ductwork for it.
Yeah, like they'll pre-wire it or
right. They're hiding it within the walls, because if you put it on after the fact, you have to put it on the outside of the house, and you see the pipe, and it's kind of, so if you look at the end of someone's house and it looks like a suitcase mounted on the end of the house with a pipe coming out of it going up above the roof, that's a radon fan. That's what it is.
Yes. So it's not the actual, well, in that case it is, but the new construction homes.
In new construction, they hide all that in the walls. They build it in.
Right.
In a lot of cases. So it's a good question to ask a builder on a new construction home. Have you already included a radon treatment system? A lot of them will. Are we all good on radon gas?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So take a look at this question then. It says, which of the following statements is accurate regarding radon gas? A, radon is a naturally occurring gas that is present in nearly all properties at all times. B, radon can be recognized by the slight yellow tint of the gas under ultraviolet light. C, radon gas should be remediated if levels exceed 3.5 picocuries. Or D, properties must be remediated for radon prior to any sale. One big test taking lesson. You need to learn to abandon words like this. Must and always and every and all. Folks, everything in our line of work has an exception to the rule. Everything has an exception to the rule. There is almost nothing we talk about in real estate that is an always, always, always. I mean, think about material facts. You know, we disclose things that would impact the value of the property or impact the usability of the property. Oh, except somebody who died in there, except a sex offender who lives across the street, right? Does that make sense for everybody? Those words are too strong. Don't just stay away from the always, the must. That's a really great test taking strategy. That'll help you. That's good for 10 or 15% right there on the test. Just stand away from those words. Okay. You want the kind of soft answers, you know, this is what we normally do. This is what most of the time happens, because that's really the truth in real estate. It's almost always going to be the softer answer. And A is the correct answer here. It is a naturally occurring gas that is present in nearly all properties at all times. There is radon in this room that I'm in right now. I've tested my home recently within the last 6 months, but my radon test level comes back at about 1.2 picocuries, which is well below the recommended action level. So we haven't done anything. There's just there's no reason to be concerned about it. Okay. All right. So far we've talked about two major environmental contaminants that are out there. This is the third one that they like to test on. And I don't want you to think these are the only environmental contaminants. There are lots of environmental potential issues, but these are the ones that they like to test very particularly. Asbestos is or was a very popular building material. Asbestos was very popular during the early part of the 20th century, the 1920s through the 1950s, 1960s. Asbestos was used in 100 different ways in building homes. Shingles at one point were asbestos siding on the outside of the house, asbestos glue on the tile. The tiles themselves were made of asbestos. How many of you, your grandma's house had that faux marble looking vinyl tile stuck down in the bathroom or the kitchen? Y'all know what I'm talking about, that ugly green, and it was like a charcoal gray with the green and white stripes to it, made to look like marble. That's asbestos tile. Not only is the tile itself made out of asbestos, but the glue that's holding it on the floor is also made of asbestos. Okay? Asbestos, when it becomes friable, and you need to know that terminology. That is a heavily tested terminology, friable. Friable means airborne. So think of a dust cloud, right? Like, in other words, you walk up to asbestos, and pipes were insulated with asbestos. You can walk up to an asbestos insulated pipe and you can hit it. And if dust doesn't come off of it, you could probably lick it and it's not going to hurt you. But if you walk up to that asbestos wrapped pipe and you hit it and a cloud poof comes out of that asbestos, you're going to die. No, I'm kidding. It's not, but it's dangerous. It's super dangerous. That's what friable means. It's when those particles have broken down to a small enough piece that they can become airborne. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. And that's when it becomes dangerous. That also means that renovating properties that contain asbestos is very problematic, much in the same way that lead-based paint is. Because what happens when you start tearing out walls and tearing up floors and scraping and pulling and prying? What happens?
You're breathing that stuff
Gets in the
airborne.
air.
It gets in the air, dust. And those clouds of dust contain a lot of asbestos if there's asbestos in the properties. So one of the interesting things about asbestos is it is very, very similar to lead-based paint. You can treat it in one of two ways. Either encapsulate it, which in lead-based paint, what did encapsulation mean?
Painting.
Paint over it, seal it up. Well, in asbestos, that means wrap it up. So like if you, for example, if the kitchen floor has asbestos tile on it and you want to do a new floor, what should you do if you want to encapsulate it?
The towel on it.
The new tile goes on top of the old tile. You don't take the old tile up. I mean, how many of you ever been into an old kitchen and you had to step up like half an inch when you went in there because they had put new tile on top of the old tile? What do you want to bet that was an asbestos floor under there? And they didn't want to spend an extra $10,000 to remove the asbestos, so they just said, we're going to deal with a little bit of a toe grabber here when you step up into the kitchen. Right? That's encapsulation. Of course, there's always the option to remove it. But again, that requires specialized people with specialized equipment, and it gets very expensive. Natalie said, how do you test for asbestos? You would have to bring in somebody who is certified to deal with asbestos to test the material. But there are some very recognizable things. One of the things that's really helpful with like Google, if you're worried that something might contain asbestos, you can generally Google like, okay, insulation from, Corning. When did it have asbestos? And it'll give you a picture of what the asbestos-based Corning insulation looks like. So you can kind of compare it to what you're looking at. It's usually, you can identify it by like looks and packaging or labels or that sort of thing if you want to. But you should recommend to your clients that they have an expert come in to check for it. All of these really boil down to having an expert check for them, these environmental hazards. So look at this question. It says a home is found to have asbestos insulation in the attic. Which of the following would be an acceptable method of handling the issue in a sales transaction? A, the listing agent should disclose the asbestos to any potential buyers. B, the asbestos can be encapsulated. C, the seller can have the asbestos removed. Or D, all of the above would be acceptable.
D.
D, Dave.
I think D. I like D because here's the thing. When I'm looking through these, the listing agent should disclose asbestos to any potential buyer. Yep, that would work, right? Disclose it. What's the other way we can deal with a material fact without having to disclose it?
Encapsulate it.
Encapsulate.
We can fix it, right? Like any material fact can be fixed. Well, encapsulating it, that's fixing it, so that would work. Removing it, that's fixing it, so that would work. So it looks like to me all of those are good options. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. Very good. Very good. A couple of other ones that we mentioned real quickly. Carbon monoxide is a very deadly gas. Now, the things that we've talked about up to this point are kind of slow killers. Carbon monoxide is a fast killer. Carbon monoxide is something that needs to be monitored for at all times because this is not something that's going to be present in a property for years and years and years before it does damage. You could develop a carbon monoxide problem and everybody in the home be dead in a day. It is that toxic. It is a very silent and very quick killer. That is why, and I have circled it on this slide. In residential rentals in this state, and this will show up on a test, I would imagine. In residential rentals in North Carolina, the landlord is responsible for placing not only smoke detectors, but also carbon monoxide detectors in the property at the beginning of the lease. So if you get a question about the landlord's responsibility, what is their responsibility about carbon monoxide if they're renting a property out in North Carolina?
You have to have a detector.
Yes.
Have to have a functioning detector at the beginning of the lease. But, and I've given you a separate slide for it, because people get hung up on this. Landlords in North Carolina do not have a responsibility to replace the batteries in those smoke detectors and that carbon monoxide detector. That is the tenant's responsibility. I'm going to guess they're going to sneak that in there on a test. You know, so this would also apply to property managers. If you were serving as a property manager, make sure that you document that you've provided a functioning smoke detector and carbon monoxide detector. It would be nice probably if you change the batteries, but legally that is the tenant's responsibility. Are we all good with that?
Yes.
Okay. Now, I know some of you are very curious about your side gig. So let's talk about those of you who are manufacturing meth in the property and why that might represent a potential material fact. I mean, some of you might be like a Heisenberg in the making. We don't know.
Don't knock it till you try it.
Exactly. Exactly. You might make some of that blue glass or whatever, you know? So if you come across a property, not if you are manufacturing crystal meth, I don't think you would be, but if you come across a property where methamphetamine has been manufactured in the property, that is a material fact. Now, remember earlier we said criminal activity was not a material fact. So like somebody is, you know, growing pot on the property. That's not a material fact. Somebody that was busted in the property for selling cocaine. That's not a material fact. So then why is methamphetamine manufacture a material fact? And the answer is because of the environmental hazard of it rather than the criminality of it. I mean, obviously it's criminal, but that's not why it's a material fact. It is the hazardous materials that are involved. Exactly. This contaminates the property itself. It can contaminate the soil. It can certainly contaminate the structure. If you've ever been into a home that was used to manufacture methamphetamine and seen what they have to do to remediate those properties, it is incredible. I mean, you're talking ripped down to bare studs most of the time. You know, sheetrock has to go, any soft, you know, obviously carpet and drapes, but a lot of times even the sheetrock has to be ripped out. Sometimes even the subflooring has to be ripped out because of the contamination associated with it. So that becomes a material fact for the property. And even if you've done all of that, it's still a material fact. Yep. If the property was ever used for the manufacture of methamphetamine. Jordan, you had your hand up, I think. Jordan, did you have a question?
Jordan, I muted everyone because I heard some shuffling. So you'll need to
sorry about that. How would you relate that to your customer, not your customer, but your client that has been exposed to this type of environment?
To a client or to a customer? Which one?
To a client. In other words, how would you tell to a client? How do you tell them to get rid of it? Is there testing or something?
Oh,
like that?
there are companies that will deal with it. You know, so to a client, I would say, okay, my knowledge has been manufactured methamphetamine here, which means we need to have a remediation company come in my opinion, and look at it and give you a quote about what they think is going to be involved in dealing with the property. Because once you buy it, it's yours. Remember, once you own it, you own the environmental issues too. And so that's how I would address it with a client. Now with a customer, I would simply say meth was made in the property. Now, some of them might think that's like a bonus. They're like excited. I don't know, you know, but that's not for me to say. Because if you're my customer, I'm just going to give you the facts. That's all. Good, Jordan? I think.
Yeah.
I think you did. Okay. All right, good. Good. We already mentioned the underground storage tanks and why those can be such an issue. Again, if it were my client, I would always recommend that they have the property checked for the potential of buried underground fuel storage tanks. Now, as a matter of sort of how you're going to deal with this to disclose it as a material fact, I will tell you, very often this is hidden. I mean, because where are the tanks, folks?
underground.
They're underground. So a lot of times real estate brokers who are listing agents who don't disclose underground storage tanks really aren't going to be held responsible, because the real estate commission is very reluctant to say you should have known that there's a tank buried in the ground out there. However, I will point out that there are some situations where they say, now you should have known something. We had one last year. Broker failed to disclose a buried underground tank. Folks, the fill pipe and the vent pipe were still sticking up out of the ground. If there are pipes sticking up out of the ground, somebody should have rattled home in their brain, like, what are those? What is that going to? What is in here? You know? So if there are obvious signs that there's a buried underground tank, yes, it would need to be disclosed as a material fact. Katrina asked if carbon, you put CO2, that would be carbon dioxide. Sorry, the biology major in me cannot let that go uncorrected. We don't have CO2 detectors. We have CO detectors, carbon monoxide. But are they needed on every level of the home? Yes, because carbon monoxide is heavier than air, so it settles. And so you need it on, every floor. Because depending on where the carbon monoxide is coming in, it could settle. So make sure you got it, particularly on every floor where there's sleeping quarters. Yeah. Y'all know what one of the biggest sources of carbon monoxide poisoning that kills people every year is?
Garage, having your car.
Their car running in the garage, remote start. They go out and they start their car, get it warm, leave the garage door closed, HVAC system's running, sucking air around that garage door, pulls it right through the house, and they never make it out. Don't do that. Don't do that. And that's why you need a carbon monoxide detector. Okay. But yes, underground storage tanks would be a material fact if there was reason to suspect that they were there, or if you know that they're there. And then finally, Seth's favorite, absolute favorite. Seth, you love it, don't you?
No.
This is Seth's absolute favorite part of the class.
Who has the pleasure somebody gets from taking this photo off of the internet and putting it into your slides? It just, I want to punch somebody.
I took a better one for you, Seth. How about that one? Was that better?
Yes, actually, that is.
For discussing septic systems.
I like that one.
That one is slightly better.
I have a problem with septic systems because of how they are named with their terms. It ticks me off. I want to know who come up with them.
So let's talk about what a septic system is. Yes, this is Banana, and that's Seth's bathroom, complete with all the grimy, dirty tile. That's exactly what. Let's talk about a septic system. For those of you who are unfamiliar, because this is the most popular method of sewage disposal in North Carolina. Much of North Carolina is still rural. In rural areas, it is almost guaranteed that the home is going to be serviced by a septic system rather than a city or county sewage disposal system. Most homes in rural areas have septic systems. We shouldn't just say septic tanks because it's an entire system. What you are looking at in this picture is not a picture of the tank itself. This is a picture of the distribution lines for the water that comes out of the tank. So it's because I wanted to give you an idea. When people say, oh, the septic tank is over there. Okay, well, that might be where the tank is, but the system can take up a tremendous amount of space within the yard. And so when you start dealing with a septic system, yes, indeed, some of the terminology is lovely, as Seth loves to point out. He loves to talk about the scum and the sludge in the tank. Those are his two
I
favorite.
swear to God, whoever came up with these terms wanted to make somebody cringe. Like, Let's come up with a shit box, and let's.
In some ways, shitbox might be a more accurate way to name this thing.
Thank you.
You know,
That I can talk about.
because that's what it is.
Sludge? Are you serious? We're rhyming sludge with fudge. Really?
So for those of you who haven't quite pieced it together yet, because there are some of you out there who are city folk and you have never thought about this. If the house is in the country, when the toilets flush, when the water goes down the drain, it has to go somewhere. And that somewhere is in a tank, which is buried in the yard on the property.
That I'm okay with.
Now, this tank is not a tank in the traditional sense. It is not meant to hold water. It is meant to hold only the solid waste. The job of the tank is to separate the solids from the liquids. That is what happens in the tank itself. The water complete with all the solids, and then that would be toilet paper, that would be the poop, that would be whatever else comes down the drain that is not liquid, comes into the tank. The tank's job is to contain and digest the solids. Yes, I said digest. The tank is supposed to eat this stuff. You need bacteria in the tank. Do not put Clorox down the drain if you have a septic tank. Do not wash your clothes with Clorox if you have a septic tank. Do not flush antiseptics down the drain if you have a septic tank, because you are killing the bacteria that are needed and necessary to keep this system functioning.
If anything, you want to flush down some probiotics.
That's exactly right. And they sell it at Lowe's and Home Depot. They sell stuff called Rid-X. Have you ever seen Rid-X in the store? It is literally bacteria in a tub. And the whole purpose of it is to replenish the bacteria. And it's like the septic tank's version of eating yogurt. You know, sometimes your belly ain't just right. You need some yogurt to get some probiotics going. And that's what Rid-X is for your septic tank, right?
You need to use it about every 2 months also.
You do, absolutely, okay? So now that the tank has separated the solids, this is where some of you are about to die, if you haven't already. The water doesn't stay in the tank. The water has to be distributed into those lines that you saw in the ground earlier so that it can be absorbed into the yard. So yes, every drop of water that goes down those drains, whether it comes from a toilet or a shower or the dishwasher or a sink, is going to end up in these lines in the yard, and these lines have holes in them so the water can get out and absorb back into the ground. The ground is performing the function of filtering the water that comes out of the system. The tank is simply holding the solid waste. Obviously, this is an essential system to the home, because if this backs up, where does it back up into, folks?
Your dishwasher.
The house.
Tubs.
And particularly the lowest drain points in your house. Your clients will know when their septic tank backs up, because their dishwasher will fill with things that should not be in their dishwasher.
I'm going to burn the house down on
The
that.
shower on the first floor will not be showerable. And for God's sake, stop putting more water down the drain until you rectify the situation, because the upstairs toilets will still flush. But guess where it's going if it can't get out?
The bathroom downstairs.
It's going downstairs into the dishwasher, into the shower,
Sink.
the sinks, because it can't get out. It cannot get out. Regular maintenance is part of owning one of these systems, folks. Yes. That means having the tank pumped every so, because if the tank's job is to contain the solid waste, can we agree that eventually the tank's going to fill up with solid waste and not be able to do its job anymore?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is
That
why,
means
like Shane's saying, maintain it.
Right. You've got to have someone come out and pump out the tank. And let me be the bearer of truly awful news. When you have a buyer client who you are representing, and they are purchasing a home that has a septic system, do you think you're going to recommend to them that they have an inspection of said system done?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Folks, the only way to inspect a septic tank is to open a septic tank and have it pumped out. Guess who's going to be there for that glorious activity, because you are representing the best interest of your client.
Yes.
Welcome to the glamorous side of the business.
We have to be present?
Yes.
Educational.
You are there to represent the best interest of your client.
You don't have to, but you need to be a good agent.
Yes.
For your client.
And I don't know why. I've never figured this out. I've never figured this out, but it is definitely true. Every person who runs one of those trucks that pumps the septic tank intentionally will bring their lunch and eat it while they're standing in the tank pumping it out, just to prove to you that they can do it.
Looking at you. Right
they
in
will
the
be
eye.
standing knee deep in it, stirring it all around and sucking it up in that truck while eating a ham sandwich.
Yes, that is actually a thing.
And you will be dying, literally dying.
We've all watched Christmas Vacation.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. I mean,
you know the trick to dealing with the smell.
What's that?
Vicks Vapor Rub.
I've heard that. Vicks Vapor Rub under your nose. Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that. I'll have to. Okay. I have to try.
I worked in a jail, and they used to smear stuff on the walls and stuff, and that's how we dealt with it.
Vicks Vapor Rub. See,
yes.
Every time I ask him, is there any way you can do it without stirring it up less? He just looks at me and is like, no, you just got to deal with it.
There was somebody in one of our continuing education classes a couple months ago, and literally they burped just like that. It was a real burp. And it rattled my eardrum.
It was a real burp. Oh my God.
And he was like,
dead in my tracks. I'm like, oh my Lord, really?
It tickled my eardrum.
So what might they ask you on the test about a septic system? This is a major deal right here. This is a test question for sure. Remember how we just saw a disciplinary action earlier today when we looked up? What was the first disciplinary action we saw? That they had said this was a 4-bedroom house when it turned out the septic system was only approved for what?
3.
3 bedrooms. Folks, homes that are utilizing septic systems in North Carolina are rated for their number of bedrooms based on the functionality of the septic system, not based on the number of rooms in the home that have beds in it.
We saw the disciplinary action today.
You saw it. Here's the thing. Why do you think they marketed it as a 4-bedroom home? Because there were 4 rooms with what?
Beds.
With beds. And all they did was walk through the house and said, okay, bedroom number 1, bedroom number 2, bedroom 3, and bedroom 4. 4 rooms, 4 beds, 4 closets, 4 bedrooms. Not if it's on a septic system. That is only true if it's on a sewage system. If it's on a sewage system, it's the number of beds that there are. But if it's on a septic system, it must be marketed based on the approved serviceability of the septic system. So if the septic system was only rated to service 3 bedrooms, I don't care if it's got 8 rooms with beds in it, you market it as a what, as a broker in North Carolina? 3 bedroom. 3 bedroom. You must. Okay. That's a material fact. Myra, you had a question?
Yeah. Let me see. I'm not muted. Okay. My house is it's 4 bedrooms, but because of the septic, it's considered 3 with the bonus room. And so can we add another septic to our land? That's
for you to discuss with the county health department and see if the land. Here's my guess. Usually, when the septic system is installed on a property, it is rated for the maximum that property will sustain. My guess is the house was built as a 3-bedroom house because that's all the septic system would sustain on the property. So probably no, most likely no. Now you might be able to put in a fancier hybrid system that has like pumps and grinders to deal with more outflow and go from 3-bedroom to 4-bedroom, but that would be up to your county health department because that's who approves septic systems.
Put you in an extra drain line.
Yeah, right. Okay. That, folks, is it for environmental issues. Isn't that lovely?